ministry, helping bring Frank Turek here on campus. I don't want to take up too much time, so without further ado, here is the one, the only Dr. Frank Turek.
Welcome, number one, Oregon Ducks. Are you going to make it through the whole year, number one? You don't sound really confident about that. Well, let's go back to September 29th, 2006. That's when Petty Officer Michael Mansour is a United States Navy SEAL operating in Ramadi, Iraq. Mansour is standing on a roof in Ramadi, and he's standing in front of a doorway to this roof. He has two Navy SEAL teammates lying in the sniper-prone position at his feet. They've already taken AK-47 fire and a rocket-propelled grenade, but they're not exactly sure where the enemy is. There's a bit of a lull in the fighting. Insurgents have blocked off the streets in Ramadi, and there's someone on the loudspeaker in the town mosque yelling, "Kill the Americans!" As Mansour and his team are looking for the next attack, an insurgent from an unknown location throws a grenade up on the roof. It hits Mansour in the chest, and it falls to his feet. Due to the length of the throw, there's no opportunity to pick it up and throw it back. He has only a split second to make a decision. He can leap through the doorway behind him and save himself, but if he does, his two teammates lying at his feet will surely die. Mansour yells, "Grenade!" But instead of jumping backward to save himself, he jumps forward chest first onto the grenade. It detonates. 30 minutes later, 25-year-old Michael Mansour is dead. His two teammates lying at his feet receive only minor injuries because Mansour's body muffled the blast. One of the survivors said at Mansour's funeral, "Mikey looked death in the face that day and said, 'You will not take my friends, I will go in their stead.'" I've never seen a United States president cry until April of 2008. That's when President George W. Bush invited Mansour's parents into the East Room of the White House to give them their son's Medal of Honor posthumously. The president couldn't even get through the citation without breaking down. Since then, Mansour's high school in Garden Grove, California, built a new stadium. They named it Michael A. Mansour Memorial Stadium. The golden trident insignia that the SEALs wear dominates the 50-yard line. January 2019, down in San Diego, California, the United States Navy commissioned the USS Michael Mansour, the newest guided missile destroyer in the fleet, Zumwalt class. There are only 3 ships in the world like this, and one of them is named after Michael Mansour. This is Mansour's mother, Sally, being escorted onto the ship, named in honor of her fallen son. Now, why did they do this? Because Michael Mansour literally sacrificed himself to save his friends. There's no greater love than to sacrifice yourself to save your friends, said Jesus of Nazareth before he went to the cross. Michael Mansour sacrificed himself to save his friends. The question is, would anyone sacrifice himself to save you? And the answer is, someone already has. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. But in today's culture, many people don't think the story's true. After all, it was written down by religious people. We know religious people can tend to embellish things. And it's got miracles in it, like a resurrection. How many people in this room, or even out there watching on the internet, have seen someone rise from the dead after you knew they were dead for at least 36 hours? Yeah, none of us. Why? Because it doesn't happen. Yet if you're a Christian, you have to believe something none of us have ever seen. How rational is that? Well, I actually think it's quite easy to show that Christianity is true. You only need to answer 4 questions. In other words, if you investigate these 4 questions, I think you're going to realize that the answer to these 4 questions is yes. And if the answer to these 4 questions is yes, then Christianity is true. Not just true for me, not just true for you, but true like gravity's true. True for everybody. What are the 4 questions? Here are the 4 questions. Now that is some pretty grooving music, isn't it? Yeah. That's actually from our TV show, which is on every Wednesday nights on DirecTV channel 378. Here on the West Coast, be 6 p.m. If you don't have DirecTV, it's on Roku. Just look for NRB TV on Roku. And if you don't have DirecTV and you don't have Roku, it's on this new technology sweeping Eugene right now. It's called the Internet. Have you guys heard of this? Yeah, if you go to our website right there, crossexamined.org, you can see the show streaming live. We're about to start a 22-lesson series on archaeology, all the major archaeological discoveries that have something to do with the Bible. That'll start Wednesday night. We're also on radio, a bunch of stations around the country, but it doesn't matter if it's on radio because it's podcasted. It's called the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. We actually do 2 a week. What we do is we present evidence for Christianity, and we cross-examine ideas against it. Now, why are these the 4 questions? Truth, God, miracles, and the New Testament. And this is going to serve as our outline here tonight. First question, does truth exist? Why is that important? Well, you hear people saying there's no truth. You know, you got your truth, I got my truth, all truth is relative. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if there is no truth, Christianity can't be true. Of course, if there is no truth, atheism can't be true either, right? Of course there's truth. If there was no truth, would this school even exist? I mean, why do you go to school, right? You go to school to learn truth. If there is no truth, would you ever read a book? Would you ever be able to catch someone in a lie if there was no truth? No, lies presuppose truth. So we're going to see in the first section, yes, that truth does exist. Second question, does God exist? Christianity can't be true if there's no God. I hope to show you tonight through 3 arguments that God really exists. These arguments are in the Bible, but you don't need the Bible to know them. In fact, you can establish that God exists without any reference to any religious work. I mean, did people know there was a God before there was a Bible? Of course. We'll see that tonight. Then the key question after that is, are miracles possible? I just asked you if anyone's seen a resurrection. Nobody said yes. But I hope to show you tonight that not only are miracles possible, but the greatest miracle in the Bible, even atheists are admitting the evidence for. We'll see that tonight. Then we're going to get to the key question, is the New Testament telling us the truth, particularly about the resurrection? The New Testament doesn't have a prayer if there's no truth, no God, or no miracles. But if truth exists, God exists, and miracles are possible. Then we can see if the evidence from the New Testament, and even outside the New Testament, can tell us whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity's true. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, game over, it's false. If you're a Christian, you might as well sleep in on Sunday and do what you want the rest of the week. Because if Jesus hasn't risen from the dead, your faith is in vain. As Paul said to the church at Corinth, he said, look, if he hasn't risen from the dead, we're wasting our time. Do you realize that Christianity is a religious worldview you can investigate and discover whether or not it's true? It's not just someone's philosophy. You can investigate it and see if it's true. So that's what we're going to try and do tonight. Now, the book goes into a lot more detail, but we're going to skim the surface, and we're going to start right here at Does Truth Exist? Are you guys ready to go? Yeah. All right. All right, ducks, here we go. Whenever you start talking about truth, you always have to start with Jack Nicholson. Right? Because Tom Cruise had him on the witness stand, and he said to him, Colonel, I want the truth. And Nicholson said, you can't handle the truth. Ducks, that was not a number 1 chant, okay? If he said it that way, the movie would have gone nowhere. You can't handle. That's not how he said it. Here's how he said it. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. All right, let's try that again. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. Now that felt better, didn't it? Didn't you always want to do that with some professor up here, you know? Actually, when people say they can't handle the truth, or what we're saying when when we say they can't handle the truth is they're making claims that actually are true, but they claim they're not true. In fact, what we're about to talk about in the next few minutes, I think is the most important thinking skill I've ever learned. And to show you what a dimwit I was 33 years old, I already had a master's degree, and I did not know what I'm about to tell you now. And you know why I didn't know it? Because I never had a course in logic. I had to go to seminary to get a course in logic. How many people in here have had a real course in logic? Can I see your hands, please? All right, see these people with their hands up? These are the homeschoolers. There they are, right there, okay? We don't teach logic in public school. We should, but instead of teaching kids how to think, we're teaching them what to feel, and that can be dangerous. Because if you just live by your feelings all the time without reason or without moral restraint, you're going to wind up in a very dark place. Yes, emotion makes life fun, but logic makes life safe. So what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes is a fundamental law of logic that you already know, but you may have forgotten you've known it. It's called the law of non-contradiction. It says opposite ideas cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense, right? For example, we can't both be at the University of Oregon and not at the University of Oregon at the same time and in the same sense, right? It's one or the other. God can't both exist and not exist at the same time and in the same sense, right? He either exists or he doesn't, but not both. You guys with me? All right. Now, we're going to apply this law of non-contradiction to several statements you hear in our culture today that try and deny truth exists. In fact, here's a very straightforward denial of truth existing. People will say there is no truth. This is the relativistic postmodernist claim. Now, there's just one big problem with this. When somebody says there is no truth, you should ask that person a question. What should the question be? Yeah, if somebody says there's no truth, you're going to say, hey, is that true? Is it true that there's no truth? Because if it's true that there's no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true. Did I say that right? I know that can give you intellectual constipation if you think about it long enough. But can everybody see this is a self-defeating statement? What's a self-defeating statement? A self-defeating statement violates the law of non-contradiction. If this statement is true, it's false. You see the problem with it? It claims there are no truths. At the same time, itself claims to be true. It would be like if I said I can't speak a word in English. What would you say? Hey, you're using English to say it. Or if I said my parents had no kids that lived. Or my brother is an only child, right? These are self-defeating statements, and you got to get good at recognizing self-defeating statements. And here's how you do it. What you do is you turn the claim on itself. You turn the claim on itself by asking a question. So if someone says there's no truth, you turn the claim on itself and you ask, is that? Now notice, you're not being unkind because you're not making statements, you're asking questions. So you can wow your friends with just questions. They say there's no truth and you ask, is that true? Let's just do a few more. Suppose someone were to say there's no such thing as absolute truth. If you turn the claim on itself, what question are you going to ask back? Is that an absolute truth? Or you might want to say, are you absolutely sure? Can everybody see this is an absolute truth claim? And the claim itself says there aren't any absolute truths. It defeats itself. Now, in our culture, it's not said this way much anymore. More often, it's said, or at least hinted at, this way. There isn't the truth, only my truth. You know, you've got your truth, I've got my truth, you live your truth, I'll live my truth, we'll all get along. This sounds so right, doesn't it? It sounds like we all ought to believe this. It sounds so Oprah, doesn't it? There's just one big problem with it. It's logically self-defeating. Because if somebody says, there isn't the truth, only my truth, if you turn the claim on itself, just ask them, is that just your truth or the truth? In other words, is the statement on the top just your truth, just your opinion? Well, if it is, okay, but why should I believe it? But if you're saying the statement on the top is the truth for everyone, can't you see the first half of the statement says there aren't any the truths? Can everyone see this is a the truth statement, claiming there are no such thing as the truth statements? It defeats itself. It's like saying I can't speak a word in English. Now, I know it's very unpopular to say this in our culture today, but I've got to say it anyway. There's no such thing as your truth. There's no such thing as my truth. There's just the truth. I mean, if you want to say you have your own truth, you might as well say I have my own math. I mean, imagine if Warren over here, who organized this whole thing, said, hey, Frank, can you hang around here at the University of Oregon tomorrow? We need some work done around campus, and if you do, I'll pay you $10 an hour. You just tell me how many hours you work, and I'll pay you at the end of the day. Now, actually, Warren would never do this. He doesn't pay that much. All right. But let's suppose I did. I hung out and worked dawn to dusk tomorrow, and in fact, 15 hours. I went into the night. And he said, okay, what do I owe you? I said, okay, 15 hours times $10 an hour, you owe me $150,000. He's going to say, what? No, I owe you $150,000. And I say, oh, no, you don't understand. I have my own math. He's going to say, you're crazy. There's not my math or your math. There's just math. Now, parents, I'm not talking about the kind of math your kid brings home and you go, this isn't my math. That's not what I'm talking about, all right? I'm saying there's one answer to a math problem. It's not my answer or your answer. It's the answer. And there's just one truth. It's not your truth or my truth. It's the truth. And until we start realizing this as a nation, we're going to have a lot of trouble, because if you start living by false statements, eventually you're going to smack up against reality and it's going to hurt. This is probably the biggest claim you'll hear, especially if you're a Christian. You ought not judge. In fact, Jesus said, don't judge. Why are you judging, you hypocrite? All right, let's put Jesus aside for just a second. Logically, what's the problem with this claim? Yeah, if somebody says, you ought not judge, if you turn the claim on itself, you're simply going to ask, isn't that a judgment? Or you can say, if we're not to judge, why are you judging me for judging? You say, wait a minute, Frank, didn't Jesus say don't judge? Nope, never said it. Sure he did. He said it in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. This is right in the middle of his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. All right, what I'm about to say here is going to sound weird for a minute, but stick with me, it's true. Exactly. There are no verses in the Bible. There are no verses in the Bible. Do you think when Matthew was writing his biography of Jesus, which we now call a gospel, when he got to this point, he said, here's chapter 7, verse 1. No. When were the chapter and verse divisions added? About 500 years ago to help us navigate the text, which is really important. I mean, if you're a Christian and you go to church and you don't have any numbers in your Bible and your pastor doesn't have any numbers in his, imagine him getting up one Sunday morning, opening up this big book and going, let's go about 2/3 of the way in. Let's see if we can find the same spot. No, you couldn't do that, right? You need numbers to help find your way around. The problem is we tend to think if it's got a number in front of it, we can take it out and make it say whatever we want. We can't do that. We got to read around the passage to see what's going on. Now, some of you are going to hate me for this, but I don't care. I'm leaving tomorrow, all right? This is why if you're a Christian, you should never say that Jeremiah 29:11 is a promise to you. What's Jeremiah 20? You know Jeremiah 29:11. This is on coffee mugs. This is on posters. This is on pillows. You know Jeremiah 29:11. Oh, the plans I have for you. Plans to prosper you. Plans to give you hope in a future. Is this a promise to 21st century Christians living in Eugene, Oregon? No. Who's that a promise to? That was a promise to the exiles that were forcibly taken out of Judah in 586 BC by the Babylonian dictator Nebuchadnezzar. He took them all the way to Babylon, modern-day Iraq, and God, through the prophet Jeremiah, was telling them that 70 years later, he was going to bring them back into the land and prosper them. And it happened. In 516 BC, they went back into the land and started to rebuild the temple. But it's not a promise to us today. It's a promise to those people back then. In fact, when some people say to me, hey, Frank, I'm claiming Jeremiah 29:11 as a promise to me, I say, why don't you claim Jeremiah 44:11 as a promise to you? What's Jeremiah 44:11? Jeremiah 44:11 is the promise God made to the exiles that went to Egypt. And he warned them, don't go to Egypt. You know what Jeremiah 44:11 says? It says, I will destroy you and all Judah. You don't see that stitched into a pillow. You don't see that on a coffee mug. You don't see that on a birthday card, happy birthday. I will destroy you and all Judah. That is so sweet, Grandma. Thank you so much. No, we're taking stuff out of context. The Bible is not a series of proverbs. Yes, it has a book of proverbs, but not every verse is a proverb. You don't just take it out and make it say whatever you want with it. You got to read around it. The same thing is true in Matthew 7. When Jesus says, judge not, does he stop right there? What does he say? Judge not, lest you be judged by the same standard you judge others, you be judged by that standard. So before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, you hypocrite. Notice that's a judgment, you hypocrite. Take the log out of your own eye first, then you'll be better able to help your brother. Then he goes on to talk about don't cast your pearls before swine, which involves a whole other series of judgments. Is Jesus telling us not to judge here? No, he's telling us to take the speck out of our brother's eye. That involves making a judgment. He's simply saying, get that problem out of your life first so you can better help your brother. So this is not a command not to judge. It's actually a command on how to judge. Don't judge hypocritically. If you've got that problem, fix it, then go help your brother. But it would be completely ridiculous to say don't make judgments. Why? Number one, it's a judgment itself. And number two, you'd be dead already if you didn't make judgments. You made 100 judgments just getting over here tonight. Now you're going, this was a bad judgment. This guy's crazy. Right? Everybody makes judgments, no matter what you believe. Atheists make judgments. They judge there's no God. They judge Jesus didn't rise from the dead. They judge the Bible writers are not telling the truth. They judge there is no objective meaning or purpose to life. When you die, you're just going to become worm food. It's over. Have a nice day. These are all judgments. The question isn't whether or not you can make judgments. The question is, are your judgments true? I will say this, though. Jesus did save a very stern rebuke for people who were judgmental. And who were the judgmental ones in his day? Pharisees. Who were the Pharisees? What did they do? They were the religious and political leaders of Israel. Some of them were on the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council that sentenced Jesus to die. And Rome delegated day-to-day lawmaking authority to them. They were the lawmakers. And Jesus went after these people. Are you telling me Jesus got involved in politics? Yes. And by the way, he wasn't so nice doing it. In fact, if you think Jesus was a sweet guy who's never said a bad word about anyone, you have not read John chapter 2, John chapter 8, or Matthew chapter 23. What happens in John chapter 2? Jesus makes a whip, and he goes and he jacks people up in the temple. Sweet and gentle Jesus did this? Yes! And then in John chapter 8, he's having an argument with these politicians, these Pharisees, and he's right in the middle of an argument with them when he says, your father is the devil. Jesus, you can't say that. That's not very Christ-like. Excuse me, I am Christ? Can you imagine you're having an argument with somebody and you go, your father is the devil. Never try that with a sibling, by the way. And then in Matthew 23, Jesus really goes after these Pharisees. And when he says, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Oh, you look great on the outside. You're whitewashed tombs, but on the inside, you're full of dead men's bones. You go a mile to make a convert, and then once you make them a convert, you make them twice as much a son of hell as you are. How will you avoid being condemned to hell? What? Sweet and gentle Jesus said this? Yes, Jesus was not Barney. Can't we all get along, boys and girls? No, I came to bring a sword. It's going to divide mother and daughter, father and son. How often you hear those passages talked about? But many of you in this room, and maybe many of you watching out there, know those passages are true because you're divided in your own family over Jesus. And you should be. Because if Jesus is God, you ought to be following him. Not what the culture says, not even what your family says. You ought to be following him. By the way, here's one other thing Jesus said to the politicians. This is easy to remember. It's Matthew 23:23. He said, you're tithing your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former, you blind guides. You strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Translation, what's he saying? He's saying, you're tithing your spices. You're doing the little things, and you're ignoring the bigger issues. We're doing that in this country. Do you realize we're telling people what light bulbs they can and can't use, but we won't say don't murder your children? Some people want to ban plastic straws, but we don't want to ban child mutilation. Are we neglecting the more important matters of the law? Look, I don't know about you. When it comes to the election, I don't really like either candidate. Are you with me? Okay? But remember, according to Jesus, you need to vote the more important matters of the law. You might not like, and by the way, when you're voting for president, you're not voting for one person. You're voting for 5,000 people to go to Washington and implement an agenda, implement a platform. It's not all about one person. There's a whole ton of people going to Washington with whoever wins. And if you don't like either, go with the policy. Policy's going to outlast personality every time. Now, Jesus was tough, and he made judgments without being judgmental. And we have to make judgments without being judgmental. In fact, it's been said this way: evangelism is just one beggar showing another beggar where the food is. Nobody in here is going to make it. Nobody out there is going to make it to God because you're better than anyone else. We're all fallen. We don't make it on what we've done. We make it on what he's done. He's the one that is our sacrifice. So don't think you're better than anybody else and you're going to make it to God like you're winning brownie points. No, that would be being judgmental. You have to make judgments without being judgmental. Now, there's many more of these self-defeating statements. We don't have time to get into it. We got to go to the next point. But can everyone see that this statement right here shoots itself? Can everybody see that? Which means relativism and postmodernism are false because they claim it's true that there is no truth. Now, tragically, most of our universities and many of our high schools have bought into postmodernism, the truth that there is no truth. In fact, as you know, we're here tonight talking about this. We've been to many other campuses. This, actually, I wanted to show you a picture here. See if I have it here. Yeah, this is a picture from an event we did at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And they love the Bible there about as much as the University of California at Berkeley does. And we always have a microphone set up, and this is the microphone for Q&A later. And I ask people who are not Christians a question sometimes. So if you're not a Christian and you're here, thank you for being here. If you ask a question, I may ask you this question, but it's not fair for me to do that without telling you what the question is in advance so you can think about it. Here's the question. If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? I've had atheists stand at that microphone in front of hundreds of people and say, no. No. Wait, I thought you claimed to be reasonable. I thought you claimed to be rational. How is it you wouldn't believe something if it were true? Well, it's not about reason. It's not about rationality. It's not a head issue. It's a heart issue. They don't want it to be true. They don't want there to be a God. Why? Because they want to be God over their own lives. They're not on a truth quest. They're on a happiness quest. And they're just going to believe whatever they think is going to make them happy. Here's the problem. You kind of can make yourself happy over the short term, doing a lot of fun, but ultimately selfish and sinful things. Yet over the long term, it's a disaster. And everyone in this room over 40 years old knows what I'm talking about because many of us have tried it ourselves, right? I'm going to live it my way. I'm going to do everything my way. No, you're not. If you are, you're going to wind up divorced, addicted, broken, alone, and probably prematurely dead. If you want contentment, you've got to go straight through truth, and Jesus is the truth. So always ask people, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? If they hesitate or say no, not a head problem, heart problem. By the way, atheists can ask the same question of Christians. If atheism was true, would you become an atheist? Or you just believe in it because you want it to be true? Well, let's look at the evidence. Let's see if it is true. We know that truth exists. Now let's move on to the second question, does God exist? And I mentioned three arguments we're going to look at for God. Not in a lot of detail because we don't have a lot of time, but I'll mention them here. The first argument is the argument from the beginning of the universe, known as the cosmological argument. Now, cosmological comes from the Greek word cosmos, which means world or universe, and it says if the universe had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. The second argument is the argument from design, known as the teleological argument. Telos is a Greek word meaning design or purpose, and it says if there's design in the universe and design in you, life, then there has to be a designer. Now, these two arguments have some scientific evidence behind them. The third argument is not a scientific argument. It's more philosophical in nature, yet it's the argument we've all known since we were very small children. It's the argument from morality known as the moral argument. And it says if there's one thing morally wrong out there, just one, like it's wrong to torture babies for fun. It's wrong to murder 6 million people in a Holocaust. It's wrong to walk into a grammar school and shoot 9-year-olds. Then there has to be a God. Why? Because if there is no standard of righteousness outside of ourselves that we're obligated to obey, then everything's just a matter of opinion. That's just your opinion against a baby torturer's opinion, or your opinion against, say, Hitler's opinion, or your opinion against some school shooter's opinion. Well, we know those issues aren't a matter of opinion. If that's the case, there must be this standard out there of righteousness that we're obligated to obey. That standard is what we mean by God's nature. If God doesn't exist, nothing's right or wrong. There are no rights. Everything's just a matter of opinion. We'll get to that later. We got to start at the cosmological argument. Now, you got to admit, it was worth coming here tonight just to see God do that. Did you see that? Some of you say, I've never seen God move. Oh, really? Check this out. Look at that. Now, this is the argument that many say points back to the big. Now, I know there may be some Christians in here going, Frank, we don't believe in the Big Bang. You guys don't believe in the Big Bang? I believe in the Big Bang. I just know who banged it. In fact, the evidence for the Big Bang is so good that even atheistic scientists like Stephen Hawking, who was probably the top physicist in the world until he died about 6 years ago. As you know, Hawking was kind of a medical miracle. He got ALS decades ago. Usually that kills you in a couple of years. He lived with it for decades. Anyway, here's what Hawking said, despite being an atheist. He said, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Space, time, and matter literally had a beginning out of nothing. Now, we're not going to go into the evidence for this. Why? Number one, we don't have time. Number two, it's all in the book, chapter 3. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Number three, it's not controversial. Even the atheists are admitting it. What is controversial is what could have caused the universe to come into existence out of nothing. Let me just say one thing about that, and then we're going to move to the next argument. If space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing, which most people, given the evidence, say, yep, that's what happened. The only thing that could have caused that, it seems, is something outside of space, time, and matter. In other words, the cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create. Because to go from a state of nothingness to a state of creation, someone had to make a choice, and only persons can make choices. Also, the being would have to have a mind to be able to make a choice. In other words, the being would have to be intelligent. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when you think about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause, who do you think of? God. You say, well, how do you know it's the Christian God, Frank? We don't. Yet. This could be Allah. This could be some other theistic or deistic God at this point. But if we keep going through the evidence and we see that Jesus really did predict and accomplish his own resurrection from the dead, then we can say that the same being that walked out of the tomb 1,991 years ago is the same being in whose divine nature created the universe out of nothing. We haven't gotten there yet. No scientific argument gets you all the way to Jesus. You need historical information for that. But this could be the God of the Bible. That's all we're saying at this point. Those 6 attributes appear right out of the data. Now, do you realize that everyone believes in at least one miracle? Christians believe in this miracle and several others, but atheists believe in a miracle. They believe that the entire universe, space, time, and matter came into existence out of nothing, by nothing. What takes more faith, to believe that someone created the universe out of nothing or that no one created the universe out of nothing? What do you think? I think it takes a lot more blind faith to say that no one created the universe out of nothing. There must be some eternal, uncaused first cause that has the power to do this. But let's move on to the second argument, the design argument. And this argument says that not only is the universe fine-tuned or designed, life, is also designed. But let's look at the universe first. Scientists have discovered in recent decades that the universe is fine-tuned. That if you were to change any one of a number of factors virtually imperceptibly about our universe, that either this universe wouldn't exist at all, or if it did, it couldn't support life. And there are dozens of these kinds of attributes about our universe, about a dozen for the universe and more than 100 for our solar system, that if you were to change any of them imperceptibly, we wouldn't exist. We'll start with Stephen Hawking, again an atheist, who said this. He said, if the expansion rate of the universe was different by 1 part in 1,000 million, a second after the Big Bang, the universe would have collapsed on itself or never developed galaxies. In other words, if you were to change the expansion rate, that infinitesimal amount at the very beginning, we wouldn't exist. Now, you can't make any sort of evolutionary sort of explanation for this. You can't say, well, it evolved to this speed by chance. Why? Because this is an initial condition of the universe. It started at the right place. It's as if the creator that created space-time and matter designed the expansion rate to be precisely what it needed to be for us to be here right now. Also, the gravitational force, if it were altered by more than 1 part in 10 to the 40th power compared to the strong nuclear force, we wouldn't exist. What's 1 part in 10 to the 40th power? That's 1 part in 1 with 40 zeros following it. You say, Frank, I can't get my head around that number. I know, neither can I. Let me give you an illustration. Take the entire North American continent, all the way from Central America to Greenland, and stack it in dimes all the way to the moon, 238,000 miles. And then do that on 1 billion other North American continents. Stack it in dimes all the way to the moon. Take all of those 1 billion or so continents stacked to the moon in dimes, put all those dimes in one huge pile, mark 1 dime red, mix it in randomly, blindfold a friend, throw him on the pile, ask him to pick that 1 red dime. The chances he would pick that 1 red dime is 1 chance in 10 to the 40th power. Is he going to pick that dime? No. You have to have a lot of faith to believe he's going to pick that dime. This is the kind of precision 1 part in 10 to the 40th power is. And this is just one of several of these environmental factors about our universe. Change any one of them, we don't exist. And there's about 100 related to our solar system. Let's take a look at the solar system here for a second. Here we are, right here, third rock from the sun. If we were just a little bit, if we were just a little bit closer to, stand by. If we were just a little bit closer to or a little bit further away from the sun, we couldn't exist. A little bit closer to, we'd burn up. A little bit further away, we'd freeze. We are what scientists call the Goldilocks zone. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. It is, that's a lie. It's too cold here in the winter. I'm already too cold, okay? The axial tilt, 23.5 degrees. Change that slightly, we don't exist. Earth rotation, 24 hours. Change that slightly, we don't exist. The size and distance of the moon from us, change that slightly, we don't exist. If Jupiter was not in its current orbit, we couldn't exist here on Earth. Why? What does Jupiter do for us? Does anyone know? Yes, its gravitational force is so strong that it attracts most of the meteors and space junk to it rather than us. It's a cosmic vacuum cleaner. In fact, if you take a close-up look at Jupiter, you see these dark marks? Those are comet fragment strikes that are bigger than the Earth. Thank God for Jupiter. Because if Jupiter wasn't there, we wouldn't be here. Saturn does the same thing. In fact, take a look at the size of the planets. There's Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Earth. Look at poor Pluto down here. You know, Pluto recently has been demoted as a planet. I don't know about you, but I think it's size discrimination. And what if Pluto identifies as a planet? What then? You bigots. Take a look at this. You can hardly see Pluto. Take a look at this. That's Arcturus. That's another star in our galaxy. Here's the sun. Jupiter is 1 pixel in size on this scale. Earth is invisible. Pluto, forget about it. All right, keep an eye on Arcturus now. Where's Arcturus now? You see it way over here? That's Antares, another star in our galaxy. The sun is 1 pixel in size on this scale. Jupiter is invisible. Earth, Pluto, forget about them. In fact, if the Earth was the size of a golf ball, Betelgeuse here, look, I don't name the stars, all right? If the Earth was the size of a golf ball, Betelgeuse would be 5 or 6 Empire State Buildings high. The heavens are awesome. And that's just in our galaxy. That's not outside our galaxy. In fact, inside our galaxy, the average distance between stars is 30 trillion miles. And all that distance is necessary for us to exist here on Earth as we exist now. Now, 30 trillion miles, how far is that? Far. It'll take you at least 2 tanks of gas in a Toyota Prius to go 30 trillion miles. You know, when we used to have a space shuttle, it used to go around the Earth. Remember that? We used to have that thing. You know, when it was in orbit, it was going 18,000 miles an hour. That's 5 miles per second. You got trouble getting to school in the morning? Take the space shuttle. 5 miles a second. Think about how fast that is. Well, I did a little calculation. I tried to figure out what if we could get in the space shuttle and try and go from our star, the sun, to another star inside our galaxy, an average distance away 30 trillion miles. In other words, how long would it take us to go 30 trillion miles if we could go 5 miles per second? How long do you think it would take us? A long time. You must be a math major. How long? It would take us 201,450 years. That means if you got in the space shuttle at the time of Christ and started traveling from our star, the sun, to another star inside our galaxy, an average distance away, you've been going 5 miles a second for 2,000 years, you would be less than 1/100th of the way there right now. And we're going to explore space. No, we're not. We're not going anywhere in space. We can hardly get out of our solar system. It took us 9 years just to get to Pluto. I mean, think about this. If our solar system was the size of a quarter, Pluto on the outer rim, sun in the center, do you know the next nearest star is more than 2 football fields away? If we could go light speed, it would take us almost 4 years. Light speed, 186,000 miles per second. It would take you almost 4 years to get to the next nearest star. The heavens are awesome. In fact, look what the psalmist says about the heavens. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him. How high are the heavens above the earth? The Hubble Space Telescope has helped us discover that. In fact, back in 2003, they trained the Hubble on 1/26 millionth of the sky. What's 1/26 millionth of the sky? Go outside tonight, put a piece of rice on the end of your finger, hold it up. That piece of rice represents about 1/26 millionth of the sky. So for 11 days of exposure time, they looked at that one little speck of sky. I'm going to show you what they found. I don't know if you can notice, but you see the bottom of this? These are mountains right here. See that? This is the southern hemisphere. I'm going to show you the video they made looking at 1/26 millionth of the sky. And when I start it, you're just going to see the constellations come up, and then it's going to zoom out to that one little pinpoint. There's no audio, it's just video. This is called Hubble Ultra Deep Field. It's in the public domain. You can Google this and find it yourself. Are you guys ready? Yeah. Okay, here's Hubble Ultra Deep Field. There are the constellations. Now let's go see what they found. What you're looking at are nearly 10,000 galaxies, each with billions of stars of their own, in 1/26 millionth of the sky. And to go from just one star to another star in our galaxy going 5 miles a second will take you over 200,000 years. Now you know what the Bible means when it says the heavens declare the glory of God. Now, how many stars are there in the entire universe? I mean, if you can find 10,000 galaxies in 1/26 millionth of the sky, how many stars are there in the entire universe? The number of stars in the entire universe are about equivalent to the number of grains of sand on all the beaches, on all the earth, times 10,000. And to go from just one to another, going 5 miles a second, will take you over 200,000 years. Now, if this is meant to communicate to us the nature of God, and it is, that God is infinite, we're in trouble. Why? Because if he's infinite, that means he's infinite in justice. And we've all been unjust. Which means we're owed punishment. Look, there's only two things you can get in the afterlife. You can either get justice or you can get grace. Does anyone in here want justice? You know, on a college campus, we're really into justice. Do you really want justice? What's God's solution? I only showed you the first half of the verse. Here's the second half. Second half says, as far as the east is from the west, so far as he removed our transgressions from us. How's he done that? If he's infinitely just and he has to punish us, but he's also infinitely loving and he doesn't want to punish us, he's got to find an innocent substitute in our place. Exactly. He's got to find an innocent substitute in our place to take our punishment for us who voluntarily takes the punishment. Can he find any one of us who are innocent? No, we're all fallen. So what does he have to do? He's got to be the substitute. He adds humanity to his deity. He comes to earth. He allows the creatures that have tortured, that have sinned against him to torture and kill him so he could take our punishment upon himself, and then by trusting in what he's done, you can not only be forgiven what you've done, but you can be given his righteousness. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why Jesus is the only way. It's not an arbitrary claim. He's not just saying, well, just because I said so. There's no other way an infinitely just being can allow unjust creatures to go unpunished. If he allows us to go unpunished, he wouldn't be infinitely just. This is why Paul, writing to the church at Rome, says God remains just and is the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. God literally comes into this world in order to take our punishment upon himself. The question is, did this really happen? We'll get into it. But before we do, when you think about a universe that has stars equivalent to sand grains on 10,000 Earths, and it takes you over 200,000 years to go between those stars, does that make you feel insignificant? It shouldn't. Why? Because as amazing as the heavens are, they're not made in the image of God, but you are. In fact, the heavens were made for you. This is you in the womb at 11 weeks. This is the second part of the design argument, your design. This is you in the womb at 11 weeks. Question, is this animal, mineral, vegetable, or human? In fact, let's go back even further than 11 weeks. Let's go all the way back to when your mother and your father got together to conceive you. Have you guys had this talk before? I see some young people in here, so I'll try and be discreet. I also see some older people in here, so I'll try and be discreet as well, just in case you've forgotten how this works. When your mother and your father got together to conceive you, your mother unconsciously perfumed her egg to attract your father, and then your father sent the entire population of the United States, 300 million soldiers, toward your mother's egg. And then there was a race, and you won. Don't let anyone ever tell you you're not special. You beat out 300 million others. You have blown away anything Michael Phelps has done. Now, seeing some of you limp in here earlier makes it hard for me to believe you were the fastest soldier in the gene pool, but you were. Now, your soldier was 20 to 30 times smaller than a grain of salt, yet it contained half of the 3.2 billion letter genome, your software program, your DNA that makes you you, all the letters in the right order, and your mother's egg was about the size of a period at the end of a sentence in an average book, and it contained the other 3.2 billion letter genome, your software program, all the letters in the right order, and when your soldier and your egg came together, a new 100% genetic human being was created. You know, you have not received any more genetic information from this point till right now. Your genetic information has just duplicated itself. In fact, there were only 4 things separating you from adulthood: time, air, water, and food. Those are the same 4 things that separate a 2-year-old from adulthood. Does this have implications on the abortion issue? Yeah, I think it does. We don't kill the 2-year-old. Why do we kill the unborn child in the womb? Genetically, it's the same. You say, wait a minute, Frank. You can't legislate morality. All right, no extra charge for this, friends. This was the subject of our first book, creatively titled Legislating Morality. All laws legislate morality. Every law declares one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. You can't think of a law that doesn't legislate morality. The only question is whose morality will be legislated. And when people say, don't impose your morality on me, I say, why not? Would that be immoral? Because you're imposing your morality on me right now. Why do you get to impose ought-nots, but I don't? Actually, the better answer is when somebody says, don't impose your morality on me, I think you ought to say, this isn't my morality. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't make up the fact that murder's wrong, that abortion's wrong, that rape is wrong, that you ought not castrate children. I didn't make up the fact that men were made for women and women were made for men, and the best way to perpetuate and stabilize society, which is the reason the government's involved in marriage to begin with, is to legally recognize that man-woman relationship over every other relationship. I didn't make any of this stuff up. This isn't my morality. This isn't your morality. This just happens to be the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one the Apostle Paul said, the Gentiles who are not of the law have the law written on their hearts. Look, if you have a problem with demorality, you don't have a problem with me. I didn't make it up. You have a problem with the Creator upon whose nature this morality is derived. We hold these truths to be, self-evident, that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, no extra charge for that. Let's go back to this. From this point till right now, a construction project of astonishing complexity began taking place. Cells began multiplying at a rate of 4,000 cells per second. Brain cells began multiplying at a rate of 100,000 cells per second. For most of you, anyway. Some cells became brain cells, others lung cells, others heart cells. How did they know how to do this? Nobody knows. Some cells went so far across you to become what they needed to become that it would be equivalent to you today walking across the United States alone. And that construction project continues to this very moment. You just made 4 million new red blood cells. You just made another 4 million new red blood cells. You just made another 4 million. Knock it off. Are you thinking about this? Are you going, wait a minute, Frank, I got to concentrate. New red blood cells coming up? No. This is just happening. How is it happening? Aristotle recognized something 2,400 years ago. Of course, he didn't know anything about blood cells, but he did notice that all of nature is going in a direction. You ever notice that when an acorn is properly nourished, it always goes in the direction of becoming an oak tree? Why doesn't it become an elm tree or a birch tree or a seahorse? You say, well, it's programmed to become an oak tree. Yeah, but who programmed it? And by the way, is an acorn conscious? Is an acorn in the ground thinking, all right, what do I have to do to become an oak tree? No. No, but it reliably goes in the direction of becoming an oak tree. If it doesn't have a mind of its own, and it doesn't, yet it reliably goes in a direction, there must be an external mind directing it toward an end. That's what Aristotle called the unmoved mover. Thomas Aquinas came along in the 1200s AD, and he said, this is going to be my 5th way to argue for God. That all of nature's going in a direction. If it's going in a direction, somebody must be directing it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why we can do science. We can do science because the universe is orderly, and the laws of nature do the same thing over and over again. If there is no God, how do we even have an orderly universe? Where do laws come from? They come from lawgivers. So God doesn't just create the universe, God sustains the universe. This is why the Apostle Paul said, in him we live and move and have our being, and Christ holds all things together. And the writer of Hebrews says, God sustains all things by his powerful word. So this argument I just gave is not a Big Bang argument. It's a right now argument. Every single second the universe exists, it's being sustained by a mind. Now, there's more in the book, Stealing from God. We don't have time to get into that now. Let's just talk about the final argument for God. And we're going to go through this very quickly. And probably the best way to deal with this argument is to ask you this question. How do you know that your quarterback throwing a touchdown is better than your quarterback throwing a pick six? That's when he throws it to the other team. They take it back for a touchdown. How do you know? It's not just the rules. It's not just the scoreboard. Crowd loves it. Who cares? What? You got to know the purpose of the game, right? If there's no purpose to the game, you can't say that a touchdown is better than a pick six. But if there is a purpose to the game, to get more points than the other team, in other words, to win, then you can say the touchdown is a good play and the pick six is a bad play. If there is no purpose, all you can say is the plays are different. You can't say they're good or bad. Now notice that the purpose of the game comes from outside the game. Who are you going to play? Illinois this week? Somebody like that, right? Okay. The rules are already set. The purpose is already set. Do the players make up the rules or the purpose? No. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from the NC2A, right? And they get together and they decide what the purpose is and what the rules are, and every once in a while they change the rules a little bit. Why? Because the game of football is arbitrary. It could be different. But the game of life isn't arbitrary. The purpose and the rules come from outside the game, but they're not arbitrary rules. If there is nobody outside of earth, if there is nobody that we're obligated to obey, no standard outside of ourselves, then there is no purpose, which means there is no right way to live, and there's no wrong way to live. Everything's just a matter of opinion. Here's another way of looking at it. How do you know, or how can you discover who's right and who's wrong? Mother Teresa, the Catholic nun who served the poor most of her life, or the murderous German dictator Hitler? How do you know who's better or worse? Well, let me ask the question this way. How do you know which map of Scotland is better? What would you need to see to know? You would need to see a real unchanging place called Scotland, right? If Scotland didn't exist, then these two maps are meaningless. But since Scotland does exist, we can see that map A, while it's not perfect, is a better representation of the real Scotland than is map B. In other words, we have an external standard by which we can measure these two maps. That's exactly what we do when we compare Mother Teresa and Hitler. Mother Teresa wasn't the standard. Hitler wasn't the standard. There's a standard beyond both of them by which we measure both of them. And we say Mother Teresa measured up to the standard better than did Hitler. That's what we mean by God's nature. If there is no God, nothing's ultimately right or wrong. In fact, Christians, even people who are not Christians, know this intuitively. What's the biggest objection you get if you're a Christian? You're a hypocrite. Now, when somebody calls you a hypocrite, I think you ought to say at least two things. First thing you ought to say is, you're right. So? Yeah, I don't live up to my standards. Do you live up to your standards? You know, nobody lives up to their standards perfectly. We're all hypocrites. Second, you know, you've just given evidence for God. Why? Because if there is no God, why is hypocrisy wrong? Nothing's wrong if there is no God. Now, I know there's probably some people in here who have been hurt by other Christians and have been hurt by the church. I get it. Very It's very hard to deal with sometimes. However, Dr. John Dixon, who now teaches at Wheaton, asks you to consider this question if you've ever been hurt by a so-called Christian or the church. When somebody plays Beethoven poorly, who do you blame? You don't blame Beethoven. So when somebody plays Jesus poorly, you don't blame Jesus. Look, just because I'm not true and beautiful doesn't mean Jesus isn't true and beautiful. Newsflash, Christianity is not Christians. Christianity is Jesus. Keep your eyes on Jesus. We're all fallen. We all need a Savior. I don't know if any of you remember Christopher Hitchens. Many years ago, I had a couple of debates with Christopher Hitchens. He was a brilliant British atheist who sounded more brilliant than he was because he had a British accent. Anyway, Hitchens wrote a book called God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, where he tried to say that religious people have done a lot of evil things. And I agreed with him. I said, you're right, we have done a lot of evil things, but you're proving our worldview, Christopher. First of all, how do you know what evil is unless you know what good is? You can't. And you don't have good in your worldview. You're a materialist. You believe we're just molecular machines. We're just moist robots. There's nobody outside the game that establishes what the purpose of life is. So how can you say there's a good way and a bad way or a right way and a wrong way? You can't. And I said, you're right, but I am a hypocrite. I can't live up to what Jesus told me to live up to. But if I could, I wouldn't need him. If I was perfect, I wouldn't need a Savior. And I said, when people tell me I can't go to church because there's too many hypocrites down there, I always say, come on down, pal, we got room for one more. The church is a hospital for sinners. It's not a country club for saints. In fact, to say I can't go to church because there's too many hypocrites down there is like saying I can't go to the gym because there's too many out-of-shape people down there. Well, of course, why are they at the gym? At least partially to get into shape, right? And one of the reasons you go to church, at least partially, is to get into shape, spiritual shape. Of course. You say, well, how do you love people then? Don't you have to approve of what they do? No. Oh, one other thing about Hitchens, by the way. Religion doesn't poison everything. Everything poisons religion. Look, I poison religion. I don't live up to the pure words of Christ. That's why don't keep your eyes on me, keep your eyes on Jesus. He came to save me because I need saving. But in our culture, we tend to think that love means approval. Does love mean approval, ladies and gentlemen? I can prove it to you that it doesn't. How many people in here are parents? All right, how many people in here are former children? Okay, good. That's all of us then. Here's the question. If your parents approved of everything you wanted to do when you were 13, would they have been loving parents? No. You need to stand in the way of evil if you're going to love somebody. You just can't approve of what everybody wants to do. You can't approve of what a 13-year-old wants to do. You need to stand in the way of evil. If you don't, you're enabling the kid. And the same thing is true even when you run into adults who are doing evil things. If you love them, you're not going to just approve of it. Love means seeking what's best for the other person according to God's will. Not what the other person wants, not what the culture wants. That's how you love people. Too often we don't tell them the truth, though. Why? We're trying to protect ourselves. We don't want them mad at us. When Jesus said, if you love somebody, you'll love them as I loved you. How did he love us? He sacrificed himself for us. So love requires some sacrifice. But when we tell people what they want to hear, we're not really sacrificing for them. We're sacrificing them for ourselves. In fact, Thomas Sowell, who's now 94 years old and says everything well, look what Sowell said. He said, when you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. How often do we tell people what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear? No, love doesn't require approval. And by the way, one other thing. I know the college campus is really excited about rights. You notice we've been creating rights every 10 minutes lately? But do you realize that many of the people who are claiming they have new rights are atheists? And do you know if there's no God, there are no rights? There's not only no right to abortion, there's no right to life if there's no God. There's not only no right to same-sex marriage, there's no right to natural marriage if there is no God. There are no trans rights, there are no Christian rights, there are no human rights, there are no rights of any kind if there is no God. Everything is just a matter of opinion. Now, nobody in here really believes that, do you? Let's sum this whole thing up. From the cosmological argument, we can see that we have a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent creator. From the design argument, we see that this being has a lot more intelligence than we thought, and we also see that he sustains the universe. And from the moral argument, we see that this cause is also morally perfect. So when you combine these three arguments together, you get a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent creator who created and sustains all things and is moral. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the God of biblical Christianity, and we haven't even opened the Bible yet. This is called natural theology. You don't need the Bible to know this. You need evidence for Jesus to know if Jesus is God. But you can establish that there's a theistic God out there without any reference to any religious work. In fact, if someone ever asks you, how do you know that God exists? Here's what I think you ought to say. I know God exists by his effects. If there's a creation, that's an effect. I'm reasoning back to a cause, a creator. If there's design in the universe and design in you, that's the effect. I'm reasoning back to a cause, a designer. If there's a moral law written on my heart, that's the effect. I'm reasoning back to a cause, a moral law giver. If there's evidence that a man predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead, that's the effect. I'm reasoning back to a cause that could create that effect. Who could do that other than God? Even if you think you've had some sort of spiritual experience with God, answered prayer, or you thought God has told you something, you're doing the same thing. You're saying the answered prayer is the effect, and you're reasoning back to a cause. This is what scientists do, ladies and gentlemen. They reason from effect to cause. That's what science is all about. Finding causes for the effects we see around us. This is why theology is the ultimate queen of the sciences. Because you're taking all the effects around you and you're putting them under one logical umbrella. And you're saying that this ultimate cause started and sustains all this. Here's the problem with atheism. They have no cause. And if you have no cause, how can you be scientific? You can't. The only question we have now is, who is the real God? We seem to have a theistic God. Who's the real God? For that, we got to move to Are Miracles Possible? And you're probably going, Frank, we're running out of time. How are we going to do this? This is really quick. Are miracles possible? All right? If God exists, we already know miracles are possible. But let's just address it a little bit more. First of all, a lot of people think miracles are impossible, like Noah and the ark. Hey, Christians, can we agree on one thing? Noah and the ark is crazy. Admit it, it is. Anyone seen a resurrection? I already asked. None of us have. Why should we believe it? And for some reason, the big problem miracle in the Bible is Jonah. Is that a whale of a tale or a tale of a whale? I mean, what is it? Can you really believe in Jonah? I mean, come on. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what is the greatest miracle in the Bible? It's not the resurrection. Resurrection's easy compared to the greatest miracle. Yeah, the greatest miracle in the Bible is the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If that verse is true, every other verse is at least possible. And isn't it interesting? Atheists are admitting the evidence for the first verse. They don't think it's God, but what else could it be? You know what Hawking's explanation was? And he says this on page 180 of the last book he wrote called The Last Design. And I'm quoting. Here's what he said. Here's how he explains the creation of the universe. The universe can and will create itself out of nothing. No, let me start over. He said, because there's a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Hello, McFly. Because there's a law like gravity, the universe can't. First of all, there was nothing known as gravity. There was nothing, no space, no matter, no time. And even if there was gravity, gravity doesn't create things. Gravity takes existing things and does something with it. This was his explanation, to which the esteemed philosopher and mathematician John Lennox, who teaches at Oxford and is also a Christian, said this about Hawking. When brilliant scientists utter nonsense, it's still nonsense. Now, if Genesis 1:1 is true, every other verse is at least possible. Of course Noah's crazy, unless God exists. Of course Jonah's a fairy tale, unless God exists. Of course resurrections don't happen, unless God exists. You can't rule it out. If God exists, these things are possible. And Genesis 1:1 appears to be true. Now, last thing I'm going to say on this, because we got to get to the New Testament. A lot of people don't believe in miracles because they haven't seen one. Well, there's a lot of things you believe in that you haven't seen, but let me leave that aside. Do you realize that no miracles have had to occur since the first century for Christianity to be true? I think some have, but you don't need them. For atheism to be true, every single spiritual experience, including demonic spiritual experiences, and every single miracle claim in the history of the world has to be false. Is that possible? That's possible. Is it reasonable to believe? I don't think so. No, look, miracles by definition have to be rare if they're going to get our attention. If miracles happened all the time, we wouldn't consider them miracles. We could say, hey, this stuff happens all the time. I mean, imagine if resurrections occurred routinely. What would the resurrection of Christ mean to us? Nothing. You go to somebody and you go, hey, Jesus rose from the dead to prove he was God. And the guy goes, so what? Uncle Leroy just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago. Now I got to give the inheritance back, right? No, it's got to be a rare event if it's going to get our attention. It can't be a regular event. In fact, there are things that happen in this world that are so spectacular, but they're regular, that sometimes we get jaded by them. But when we think about it, we should say, man, there's intelligence behind this. Like, for example, how many people in here have seen your own flesh and blood born? Every mother should raise your hand. It's the fathers. Now, when you see another human being, your own flesh and blood, either come out of you or come out of your spouse, you don't go, evolution, right? You go, this is amazing. We made whoopee 9 months ago, and now look at this. How does this happen? This is spectacular. But since it happens every day, a lot of times it's just ho-hum, isn't it? You know, Ariel Roth, a biologist, said this: God never did a miracle to convince an atheist because his ordinary works provide sufficient evidence. I mean, just look at the person next to you right now. Why is that person even conscious if they're not asleep? I mean, how can you even think and decide to do things? You're not a molecular machine. You're not a moist robot. You're a being with a soul and a mind who can make choices because you're made in the image of the great mind. So miracles are possible. Now the key question: did the big miracle known as the resurrection actually take place? Now, in the book, we have a chapter called The Top 10 Reasons We Know the New Testament Writers Told the Truth. We don't have time for 10. We're only going to briefly look at 2. And the first one we're going to look at is something called embarrassing stories. What are embarrassing stories? Historians know that if a writer is recording embarrassing stories about either themselves or other people implicated in the story, it's probably true. Why? Because you're not going to invent stories that make you look bad, that embarrass you. You might make things up that make you look good, but you won't make things up that make you look bad. In fact, let me ask you guys a question in here. How many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look good? If you don't have your hand up right now, you're lying to make yourself look good. And it's not working. We know you're lying. All right, how many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look bad? No, you don't lie to make yourself look bad. You might lie to make yourself look good, but you won't lie to embarrass yourself. Now, the New Testament writers have filled the New Testament with embarrassing stories they never would have invented. That's why we call this the duh factor. Let me just give you a few of them. At one point, Jesus turns to the leader of the disciples, Peter, and he says, "Get behind me, Satan." He just called the leader Satan. Now, do you think Mark, who wrote this down at one point, said to Peter, "Hey, Pete, I'm going to make this a real interesting story. I'm going to have the Lord call you Satan"? What do you think Peter would have said? "Have him call you Satan. Look, I'm the leader here. This doesn't look good." And then Peter says, "Lord, I'll never deny you." What does he wind up doing? He denies him 3 times. And then at the crucifixion, all the disciples, maybe with the exception of one, they all run away for fear of the Jews. This is like a Monty Python movie. Run away, right? And who are the brave ones? The women. That's right, women. You can give yourselves a hand. That's right. I am woman, hear me roar. I didn't run away like you sissy pants men did. Now, who wrote the New Testament documents down? Men. Now, what man is going to invent that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb? Would any man in here invent that? I mean, if I was there and inventing it, I'd make myself look good, wouldn't you? I mean, I'd write down something like this. We marched right down there and we overpowered that elite Roman guard. Yeah, that sounds good. John said, get out. Peter roundhouse kicked him. Thomas said, we'll be back. No doubt. Some of you will get that tomorrow. And then on Sunday morning, we marched right down to the tomb, and we saw Jesus, who congratulated us on our great faith. And then we went and comforted the trembling women. I would never say it was Mr. Sissy Pants while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb. And oh, by the way, why would you never say the women were the first witnesses in that culture? Forget about the fact it was embarrassing to men, it was. But independent of that, why would you never have the women be the first witnesses? Anyone know? Yes, because a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. So if you want a credible story, you'd only have the men be the first witnesses. Yet all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which is telling us what? They really were. In fact, their star witness was a formerly demon-possessed woman. Gee, what a credible witness you got there. I actually had a woman come up to me once and she said, Frank, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. I said, that is an excellent point. I had not thought of that. Because ladies, when your man comes home from work, does he say much? There could have been a nuclear explosion down at the plant. He's not going to tell you. You'll see it on the news before you hear it from him. You'll be watching the news going, hey, Howard. Oh, yeah, forgot to tell you. Nuke blew up. I've been hot for 3 days. What's for dinner? He's not going to tell you. You think that's bad. I was at the University of Cincinnati. Clint and I were there almost a year ago now. It was November of last year. And a guy came up to me after the seminar and he said, you think that's bad? He said, I know of a guy who was in a private plane, just he and the pilot, and the pilot died. And my friend didn't know how to fly the plane, didn't know how to land it. So just like in the movies, the tower talked him down. When he went home that night, his wife said, how was your day, dear? And he said, same old, same old. I can't even believe this next verse is in the New Testament, but it is. Do you know when Jesus takes his disciples up on the mountain in Galilee there to give them the Great Commission? This is Matthew 28:19. Well, it says, go therefore, make disciples of all nations. Notice it doesn't say make believers. It says make disciples of all nations. So Jesus is giving final instructions, what these people are supposed to do. Do you know what verse 17 says about the people, the disciples who were there? This is what it says. As Jesus is giving the Great Commission, it says, some believed, but some doubted. What? He's standing resurrected right in front of them, and they're doubting. This is embarrassing. It's like they're going, see that guy over there? Yeah, that guy over there is Jesus. Oh, no, it can't be Jesus. He was just killed not long ago. No, I'm telling you, it's him. Jesus is dead. It can't be him. It's him. Do you know what the Romans did to him? They whipped him. They beat him. They put nails in his arms. They put nails in his feet. They put a spear in his side. Blood and water came out. I'm telling you, Jesus was dead. In fact, if the Romans didn't kill him, they could have been killed themselves. I'm telling you, it's him. It can't be. It is. How do you know? The women told me. They're not making this up. There's even potentially embarrassing details about Jesus in the text. In Mark chapter 3, it says his own family wanted to seize him and take him home because they thought he was out of his mind. They thought he was nuts. This is embarrassing. His own brothers don't believe in him. We learn later, however, that James, the half-brother of Jesus, dies as a martyr in the city of Jerusalem in 62 AD. He's the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. He's thrown off the Temple Mount, and then he's stoned by the Sanhedrin. And the Bible doesn't tell us this. You know who tells us this? Josephus, the Jewish historian, who was probably in Jerusalem at the time. He tells us this, and another writer, Hegesippus, tells us this. Why is James dying as a martyr for his brother 30 years after the alleged resurrection when Jesus was walking the earth? Prior to the resurrection, he didn't think he was God. Before the resurrection, he said, yo, bro, you're not God. After the resurrection, he said, yo, bro, you're God. Now, how many people in here have a brother? All right, how many people in here have a brother who thinks he's God? Yeah, you don't believe in him either, do you? Neither did James. Jesus is called a drunkard. He's called a madman. He's called demon-possessed. Do you think they invented this? They're calling the Lord demon-possessed. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. And oh, by the way, there are two prostitutes in Jesus' bloodline. Who are they? Rahab and Tamar. Do you think Matthew, who wrote the genealogies down, said, you know what, I really think I need to spice up the Messiah's bloodline a little bit. Let me put a couple of prostitutes in. No! In fact, there's a lot of shady people in the bloodline. Judah, from where we get the term Jew from, Jesus from the tribe of Judah, not a good guy. Judah is the guy that sold his brother, Joseph, into slavery in Egypt, and then he went and slept with his daughter-in-law, Tamar, who was posing as a prostitute, and he's in the bloodline of the Messiah. David, a man after God's own heart. Yeah, but he's a liar, adulterer, and a murderer. Gee, I guess there's hope for the rest of us then. Bathsheba's in the bloodline. But when Matthew gets to her in the genealogy, he doesn't mention her name. What does he say instead? Does anyone know? He says Uriah's wife. Ooh. He's telling the truth, but it's a slam. Who is Uriah? Husband of Bathsheba, whom David had killed to cover up his crime. They're telling the truth, but it's embarrassing. In fact, you guys know who Dennis Prager is? Dennis Prager is a conservative Jewish writer and talk show host. He's actually written commentaries on the Old Testament. He's not a Christian. He just believes the Old Testament's true. You know what he says? The main reason I know the Old Testament's telling the truth is because no people group would ever invent such an embarrassing history of themselves. You think you don't find the embarrassing stuff in Egypt's history? The Pharaoh would cut off his head, the head of his historian, if he said anything embarrassing. Even today, we hide embarrassing stuff. I don't care who's in the White House. That press secretary is a propagandist. Does the press secretary ever admit that the president has done something wrong? No, they spin. You don't get the spin in the Bible. They tell you the truth. It's the ultimate no-spin zone. Now, there's a lot more in the book, but we got to go to our final point here, and that's excruciating deaths. Now, this is the argument that says that these men who were in a position to know whether Jesus had resurrected or not died excruciating deaths when they could have saved themselves by saying, look, it never happened. Now, there's a couple things you need to remember about the writers of the New Testament. All of them were Jews. They thought they were believers in Yahweh. They thought they were God's chosen people. The only non-Jew that we know about that wrote is Luke. Everybody else is a Jew. And they didn't think a man could claim to be God. That was blasphemy. And they also didn't think that one guy would rise from the dead in the middle of time. They knew we'd all rise from the dead at the end of time because Isaiah and Daniel talk about it. But they didn't think one guy would rise from the dead in the middle of time. Why then do they say that a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead and then go die for it if they didn't expect this to happen? In fact, it's really important to look at the apostles' beliefs and practices before and after the resurrection. There's a stark contrast. Look, before the resurrection, they believed in animal sacrifice. They've been slaying lambs to Yahweh for hundreds of years. Suddenly, Jesus comes along and they go, you know what? We don't need to slay these lambs anymore because these lambs are just symbols of the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Here he is. Before they believed in a binding law of Moses. Afterwards, Christ's life is fulfilled the binding law of Moses. Before they believed in strict monotheism. Afterwards, they're believing in a trinity, 3 persons in one divine essence. Yes, the Trinity is much clearer in the New Testament, but you can still see it in the Old. Before, they believe in the Sabbath. In fact, they thought they could be stoned for not obeying the Sabbath. Afterwards, they're worshiping on Sunday, and Paul even says, don't let anyone tell you you have to obey any Sabbath or festival day. Why? Because the Sabbath demonstrated rest, and who is the rest now? The rest has arrived. We rest in the work of Jesus. Before, they believed in a conquering Messiah. Afterwards, a sacrificial Messiah. They didn't see the sacrificial Messiah the first time. When he comes again, he'll conquer, but they didn't see the first coming. Before, they believed in circumcision. Afterwards, they believed in baptism and communion. Now, before we go forward with this, go back to embarrassing testimony for just a second. Ladies and gentlemen, do you think anybody inventing a religion would choose this as their price of admission? Circumcision? Really? What do I got to do to join your group? What? No, I'm out. Forget it. Nobody's going to make this up. Now, what would have caused these pious Jews who thought they were God's chosen people to abandon everything on the left and adopt everything on the right virtually overnight? The only thing I can think of is what psychologists call an impact event. What's an impact event? An impact event is an event that is so dramatic that it can turn you around 180 degrees just like that. Some impact events are so dramatic that although you might not remember what you had for breakfast this morning, you'll remember an impact event that happened 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago if you're old enough. In fact, there's probably only a few of you that can answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If you can remember where you were and what you were doing November 22nd, 1963, hold your hand up and hold it up high. Ladies and gentlemen, you see these people with their hands up? These people are very old. All right? November 22nd, 1963 is my earliest memory. I was 2 years old and 2 days. Yes, I'm 62 years old now. I know. I don't look a day over 61. In fact, when I hit 50, my wife was very encouraging. She said, honey, you're going to live to be 100. I said, how do you know? She said, because you look half dead already. Anyway. On November 22nd, 1963, I'm a toddler. I'm standing at our home in Wanamassett, New Jersey, in the living room, and my mother is sitting on an ottoman in front of a black and white TV, weeping uncontrollably. Mommy, what's the matter? What's the matter? They killed the president. They killed the president. President Kennedy assassinated that day. I can still see in my mind right now my mother when she was 26 years old. She's 86 right now. But I can see her when she was 26 sitting on that ottoman. It is an impact event. Never saw my mother cry like that. I don't remember anything before that, and very little after that. Where were you when the second plane hit the tower? I was in my home near Charlotte, North Carolina. I had the TV on behind me. I'd seen the first tower had been hit, but I didn't know by what. Thought maybe a Cessna. So I was on the phone with this pastor from the north side of Charlotte, and we were talking about what the topic would be if I came to his church. And I said, you have the TV on? He goes, yeah. I said, maybe a Cessna hit the World Trade Tower. And we're just talking, and suddenly he goes, the second tower just got hit. I turned around, look at the TV, the second tower's on fire. I said, was it a Cessna? He goes, no, it was like a United plane. A United plane? He said, yeah, it flew right in there and exploded. I said, you saw that? He goes, on live. He said it was on live TV. I said, look, let me call you back. I hung up the phone. For some reason that morning I had CNN on. And I'm not making this up, but the commentator on CNN said, one has to think there's some sort of navigational error here. I said, you doofus. This is the clearest day in the history of the Big Apple. What do you think, the pilots can't see where they're going? I mean, do you think Stevie Wonder's flying these planes? I mean, come on. This is terrorism. I called that pastor the next day. I said, we're going to come to your church and talk about Islam because that's what this is related to. Now, 9/11 was over 23 years ago. And for those of you who are old enough, if I were to ask you where you were, you could tell me something about that day. But if I were to ask you where you were 23 days ago, most of you are going to go, I don't know, let me look at my iPhone. What was I doing that day? Why can you remember something from 23 years ago but not 23 days ago? No impact event 23 days ago. Impact event 23 years ago. Do you think if Jesus really rose from the dead, that would have been an impact event? Do you think they would have had any trouble remembering it? Especially if he then stayed around and did miracles for 40 days? No, that's the only way I could figure out why they would have abandoned everything on the left and adopted everything on the right virtually overnight. In fact, let's look at it this way. What did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? What did they get by saying Jesus had resurrected? Well, they got kicked out of the synagogue, and then they got beaten, tortured, and killed. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks. In fact, they had every motive to say the resurrection did not happen, not every motive to say it did. You know, I get this question. If you're a Christian, you might get this question too. Are there any non-Christian writers that talk about Jesus and the apostles? Yeah. They're all in chapter 9 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. However, the question often has an illicit assumption under it. You know what the illicit assumption is? You really can't trust the New Testament writers because you see, these people were biased. They were Christians. You can only look at the non-Christian writers to figure out what really happened. Now, if you think about that for more than 10 seconds, you'll realize how stupid that is. What did these people have to gain by saying it was true? Nothing. They had everything to lose by saying it was true. Now, some of you may know my friend J. Warner Wallace. He's a cold case homicide detective who's been on Dateline more than any other homicide detective because he solves murders that are decades old. Jim is also a Christian, and he's taken his homicide skills to investigate the greatest homicide of all time, the homicide of Jesus. And he has a book called Cold Case Christianity and a website, coldcasechristianity.com. Really good stuff. Anyway, Jim says this: whenever I find a body that I know has been murdered, I don't have to track down 1,000 possible motivations as to why that guy was murdered. I know that guy was murdered for one or more of these three reasons. There was either a sex issue, a money issue, or a power issue. Sex, money, or power. Those are the three things that can drive people to murder. In fact, they're the same three things that can drive any of us to sin. Why? Because sex, money, and power are good things. In fact, they're so good, we'll often take shortcuts to get them. So Jim says, if you're going to say that these writers made all this up, you got to find one or more of these three motivators. All right, let's take a look at these three motivators with regard to the New Testament writers. Ladies and gentlemen, did the New Testament writers suddenly get real popular with the ladies for saying Jesus had resurrected from the dead? No, they didn't get sex. Did they get money? No, they weren't 21st century prosperity gospel preachers. Did they get power? No, they got persecuted. They got the opposite of power. Paul had power when he was persecuting the church. As soon as he becomes a Christian, he's the one persecuted. They didn't get sex. They didn't get money. They didn't get power. There's no motive to make this up. And then why would they then go die for a known lie? Now, at this point, you might call time out, Frank. There's plenty of faiths out there that have martyrs. Are you going to say that martyrdom proves Christianity? Don't you have to say then, therefore, that, say, martyrdom proves Islam? No. Why? Because there's a lot of differences between the Muslim martyrs and the New Testament martyrs. But let me just give you one difference for our purposes here. The Muslim martyrs haven't witnessed anything miraculous. In fact, Muhammad himself says, I don't do miracles. I'm just a plain warner. They just have faith that Islam is true. But the Christian martyrs, the New Testament martyrs, witnessed the risen Jesus. They saw Jesus. They touched Jesus. They ate with Jesus. They verified with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. Yes, some people will die for a lie they think is the truth. Nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. And the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not, and they went to their deaths anyway. You can't get better evidence than that unless you were there yourself. All right, one last thing. I know this is going to sound like heresy for those of you out there who, like me, believe the Bible is the inerrant word of God, but it's not. Stick with me. Christianity is not true because a series of documents we put under one binding we call the Bible says it's true. In fact, Christianity would be true if the Bible never existed. You say, how can that be? Ladies and gentlemen, do you realize there were thousands of Christians before a line of the New Testament was ever written? Why? Because they witnessed the resurrected Jesus. They didn't read about it in a book. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, Christianity did not begin with a book. Christianity began with an event, the resurrection. There would be no series of documents that we put under one binding that we now call the New Testament, written by Jews in the first century, claiming a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead, unless a man really did claim to be God and really did rise from the dead. In fact, we could put it this way. The New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. You wouldn't have these documents unless this event occurred. Now, there's more evidence that they're telling the truth, but we don't have time for that. This is the overall argument. Does truth exist? If somebody says there's no truth, you're going to say, is that true? Does God exist? First argument. Cosmological. Second. Teleological. At least one guy got it. Third argument. Moral argument. From those three arguments, we get a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, moral, powerful, personal, intelligent creator, created and sustains all things. Are miracles possible? Greatest miracle of all? Creation of the universe out of nothing. Even atheists are admitting that. And did Jesus rise from the dead? We just looked at 2 out of like 10 different reasons to think he did. So if you want to go further, take out your phone. Take out your phone and follow that QR code. I don't have any books because we sold out in the church in Portland. So sorry, I don't have any books for you. But you can get them on our website, or you can get them on Amazon. If this QR code doesn't work, then text the word evidence to 855-909-0582. 855-909-0582. If you follow that QR code, I'm going to send you this entire PowerPoint presentation in a PDF format. I showed you maybe 50 slides tonight. The whole presentation is 362. Okay? And I'm going to send you a dozen other presentations as well, by just following that QR code or text the word evidence. And by the way, the folks watching online can do the same thing. Text the word evidence to 855-909-0582. All right? I'll put that up again during Q&A if you didn't get it. But let's sum it up this way. It's true. So what? So what if it's true? Well, the best news of all, somebody actually did die for you. Now, when I was in the Navy, by the way, Navy stands for Never Again Volunteer Yourself. I don't know if you know that, but when I was in the Navy, I was in naval aviation, and we had to earn golden wings, which were fairly hard to earn. But there's nothing more difficult in the Navy to earn than a golden trident. Very few people that start SEAL training make it through, maybe 5%. Those that do make it through wear that trident with pride. It is their identity. When Michael Monsoor was buried in Rosecrans Cemetery in San Diego, California, just about every Navy SEAL on the West Coast showed up for his funeral. And when they passed his casket, they took off their tridents and pressed them into his casket. They took their identity and put their identity in the one that died for them, the one that sacrificed for them. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to put our identity in our Savior. But our culture says, oh, no, put your identity in your political party, or put your identity in your sexual preference, or put your identity in your job or your bank account. Ladies and gentlemen, you realize how fragile those identities are? For example, if you put your identity in your sexual preference, what happens when you can no longer sexually perform, or you're no longer sexually preferred? Do you no longer have an identity? If you put your identity in your job, what happens when you lose your job? You no longer have an identity? If you put your identity in another person, God forbid, what happens when that person dies or leaves you? You no longer have an identity? Do you realize that Christianity is the only worldview where you don't achieve your identity? You receive your identity? It's free. You become a child of God and you inherit the kingdom. And you can't lose it. It's eternal. It's not fragile. It's not based on anything you have to do. Look, if you got to achieve your identity, man, all the pressure's on you, and there's always somebody that can do it better. And then what happens when you can't do it anymore? No, you're to put your identity in your Savior, who also rose from the dead. And think about it this way. Everyone you love will die. Everything you build will crumble. Everything you say will be forgotten. Everything you do will come to nothing. You and your identity will die and vanish unless the resurrection's true. If there is no resurrection, it's hopeless. Nothing ultimately matters. If there is a resurrection, then everything matters. And you have a free ticket into the kingdom by simply accepting what Christ has done, by repenting of your sins and accepting what Christ has done. Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you? It's free. But it may cost you your life. All right, we're going to go to questions now. But before we go to questions, I want to bring Warren back up here because we don't want this just to be an event. If you're interested in this kind of material, we have a group right here on campus that does this routinely, and Warren heads it. So Warren, tell people about where they can join your group and what they're going to find when they get there. Go ahead. Thank you.
Interested, you want to learn more about, I'd love if you fill this out. We'll reach out to you. We'll buy you lunch. We'll buy you coffee. We'd love to have more conversation. So think of this as your free lunch pass right here. My friend Lathan and Heather are going to be at the table on the way out. You can go ahead and give it to them on your way out. They'll collect it from you. If you are a freshman in the class of 2028, we also have a free t-shirt there for you. If you want to keep following up, Tuesday nights we meet up at Hall. It's at 7 o'clock p.m. Room 242. That's next to where they play ping pong at the ping pong club. We'd love to get connected with you. We're going through a series starting next Tuesday on maturity. What does it mean to be mature, right? People tell you all the time, act your age, act mature, but never tell you what a mature person lives like or does. So if you want to learn what maturity looks like, come on Tuesday. And one last thing, our next Common Ground speaker for November is talking about what are 5 money mistakes that college students make. If you're a college student, you might be making one of these mistakes. You don't want to miss it. That's going to be the first Tuesday in November. Correct me if I'm wrong, that's November 5th, 7 o'clock. So if you want more information about that, talk to Lathan and Heather at the table on the way out. Thanks.
Hey, before you go, ladies and gentlemen, this is Warren III. There's Warren Jr. and Warren Sr. right there. Look at that.
3 generations of Warrens right here. And Warren now is a new dad, or he's about 9 months from seeing, or what, 8 months from seeing? So they're great grandparents right over there. Hey, do one other thing. Can you tell this group the fun stuff that Christians do at the bar at midnight?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Tell them. Yeah. Tell them.
One thing our group has started doing is you might recognize us. If you're wondering, man, this guy looks really familiar. I can't put his finger on it. You might have seen me on 13th Street. About every other Friday, we go out there and we do ask us any question about God, and you're going to get a free energy drink, a free pizza, a free water bottle. You get a little goodie in response for asking us a question about God. If you have more questions for Frank that don't get talked to at Q&A, either meet us out there on 13th Street or fill out this contact card, and we'd love to get some info.
Fun stuff. What? That's right. We're thirds. All right, thanks. Thanks so much, Warren. Great ministry. All right, we're going to questions. Since no one likes to ask the first question, let's move right on to the second question. Second question here, and once the first person starts, then other people will come up. And you have to come up to the mic because people watching online won't see you if you don't come up to the mic. Or they won't be able to hear you either. So, all right. Hi, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Christina.
Hey, Christina.
This question comes all the way from my boyfriend who's living in Israel right now.
Israel?
Yeah, he's incredibly inspired by your work, and when he heard you were going to be here tonight, he was like, you need to ask this question.
Now, is he an Israeli citizen?
No, he's working for a Christian organization for kids with heart conditions, so just locating them and just giving them the assistance that they need.
Excellent. Okay, sure, go ahead. Thank you.
So Max asks, how can we direct and apply our conversations in apologetics when ministering to heart issues of people we're talking to without getting complacent in the intellectual aspects of the conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the questions you want to ask people that you're talking to when you've earned the right to do so, I think the first thing you want to do is get to know the person if you have time. Ask them their story, you know, why are they, what do they believe now, why do they believe it now, that kind of thing. But then ask them the question I mentioned before, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Or to say, if Jesus really predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead to prove he was God, would you follow him? And see what they say. Because I don't know about you, but when you're having conversations with people and they keep moving the goalposts on you, you know how that goes? You're having a conversation with somebody and they bring up an objection and you begin to answer it, and it's like they don't even acknowledge that you've answered the objection. They're on to the next thing, like, well, what about this? And then what about this? It doesn't really appear like they're interested. So one point of clarity that you can bring to a conversation is ask that question so the person is forced to answer it, and they may learn something about their motivation at that point. You know, yeah, if it was true, I wouldn't even want it to be true. I wouldn't believe it. If that's the case, if you run into somebody that's hesitant to answer the question or says no, I think there are 5 things you can do. Well, it's more than 5. There's 5 I just thought of, okay? Number 1, you can pray. You should always pray. Number 2, you can love them, which doesn't mean you approve of everything they do, as we just mentioned. Number 3, you can plant seeds every now and then. Not too much, because you'll annoy them, but you can plant seeds that show them that their worldview has an issue, is false, and Christianity is true. Number 4, you can ask a lot of questions. You know, well, why do you think that's true? What evidence do you have for that? And Greg Kokel's book, Tactics, is a really good book on that. And our app, the CrossExamined app, 2 words in the App Store, CrossExamined, has a little section on questions you can ask people when you're having an interaction. Let me just give you an example of this. Like, suppose someone were to say, you're talking to them and they say, well, I can't believe the Bible but it's because it's been changed throughout the centuries. You don't need to go into a dissertation as to why it hasn't been changed throughout the centuries. They need to give you evidence that their position is true. In other words, when somebody says something, it's not your job to refute what they say, it's their job to support what they say. So you might want to say to them, well, what do you mean it's been changed throughout the centuries? Let's see what they say, right? They may think it got to us like a telephone game, you know. You tell one person something, it goes around the room, it's all garbled by the time it gets to the end of the room. They think that's how we got the Bible, right? Second question, how did you come to that conclusion? Or what evidence do you have for that position? You'll find that most people don't have evidence. What they've heard is a slogan, and they like the slogan. But if you ask them for evidence for the slogan, they don't have it. And so how did you come to that conclusion, or what evidence do you have for that position? That question just lays bare whether or not they have evidence for their position. Most people don't. In fact, if you wanted to customize that question, what do you mean by, after you say what do you mean by that, how do you come to that conclusion, what evidence do you have for that position? You might, for that particular topic, you might say, how did you come to that conclusion? Have you investigated the manuscript evidence for yourself? I guarantee you the person's not going to say, well, yeah, just last night I was up reading a book about the Byzantine line of manuscripts, right? Nobody's going to say that. They've just heard a slogan. Now, the third question you can ask is your opportunity to provide some evidence back. And it starts with, have you ever considered? Which is just a nice way of saying, I'm going to give you some evidence. Have you ever considered that we didn't get the Bible like the telephone game? The way we got the Bible is that people who were eyewitnesses or knew eyewitnesses wrote down what they saw, and then after those original documents were written down, many of them were copied, and we have almost 6,000 handwritten Greek manuscripts from the New Testament and many more in other languages. And when you compare all those manuscripts, we can reconstruct the original with more than 99% accuracy, okay? Now, those questions, what do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? Have you ever considered? You can use for anything, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, parents, you can use this on your teenagers. Like, for example, if you get a phone call one night from your son, he said, Dad, I'm not going to be home by 11 like you wanted me to. Don't panic. First question, what do you mean by that? Second question, how'd you come to that conclusion? Third question, have you ever considered if you're not home by 11, you're grounded for 2 weeks? Be right home, Dad. By the way, husbands, never try these questions on your wife. Because if she calls you an idiot, don't say, what do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? My wife's going to have a list 39 years long, all right? Now, the fifth thing you can do is you can wait. What do I mean by wait? Not everybody is right where you are right now in terms of their spiritual journey. I mean, sometimes people ask me, Frank, how come you don't get upset with people that are rude at the Q&A mic and they don't agree with you? I say, why should I expect them to agree with me? I mean, I'm 62 now. When I was 22, I didn't agree with my 62-year-old self. So why should I expect somebody else to agree? You shouldn't expect anybody to agree with you. They're in a different place right now. That's fine. Everyone's on a journey, right? You're not where you were 5 years ago. Hopefully you're closer to Jesus now. So don't expect everybody to agree with you right now. It's a process. But if you wait, and that person does become interested in Christianity, it's probably going to be through tragedy. Why? Because sometimes you only look up when you're on your bus at some point, and that person suddenly becomes interested, your phone's going to ring, and that person's going to be on the other end. They're not going to call their atheist friend when things go bad. What's the atheist going to say? There's no rhyme or reason to life. These things just happen. Get over it. No. They're going to call you a person of spiritual depth because you've done those 5 things, right? You prayed, you loved them, you planted seeds, you asked questions, you waited, and then they're going to call you. When the student's ready, the student will summon the teacher. So I think if you do those 5 things, ask the big question first. If it were true, would you become a Christian? And do those 5 things, I think you have a shot. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you. And tell them thanks for serving in Israel. Yes, sir. What's your name?
My name is Jake.
Jake, go ahead, sir.
I first want to say thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Second, I want to thank you for doing the work that you're doing. You really got me out of a dark place during
thanks, Jake.
lockdown.
Okay.
And I might not be here if it wasn't for you.
Oh, appreciate that.
My question, it's a bit lengthy, so bear with me.
It's all right.
In John 6:51-58, Jesus speaks with uniquely explicit and forceful language regarding his flesh and blood. He declares in John 6:51 that I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. And in John 6:53 emphasizes, very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life within you. He continues in John 6:54-56 by stating, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them on the last day. For my flesh is real blood, my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. In the Greek, as Jesus intensifies his message, he shifts from the verb phagin, which means to eat in a general sense, to trogo, which is a more visceral term that translates to gnaw, munch, or chew. This change in vocabulary, particularly in verses 54-56, understands a literal understanding of his words, emphasizing the act of physically consuming his body and blood rather than interpreting it merely as a metaphor. He also uses words such as sarx, which refers to actual physical flesh, and ema, which refers to actual blood, and not a symbolic representation, both of which further underscore the literal interpretation of Jesus' teaching. Additionally, in John 6:60, many of Jesus' disciples respond with, this is a hard teaching, who can accept it? Indicating that his words were taken literally by those present. Furthermore, Jesus does not correct their interpretation, but reinforces his statement in the next verse. Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus says to them, does this offend you? In John's gospel, the
Hold on, Jake.
Yes.
I think we got the gist of it.
Okay.
Are you arguing for transubstantiation?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Before we do, he's got an announcement on another issue. Go ahead.
I just got an update from campus. They said that this room, we're going to have to start shutting it down now because we're a little over time. But if we want to continue the atrium, would that be
Well, no, we have till 9 o'clock.
I
Yeah, that's what we were told. Yeah. Okay, we can take it down in half an hour. Is that okay? We'll be out of here at 8:30. All right, thank you. Okay, all right, good. Okay, transubstantiation is something Christians argue over,
Yes.
right? Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholics will say, okay, this is the literal body and blood of Christ. Protestants will say, no, it's a memorial, okay? Now, there's a book on this that you may be interested in getting where you'll get the Roman Catholic and the Protestant position called Roman Catholics and Evangelicals, Agreements and Differences. It was written by my co-author, Dr. Norman Geisler, and another guy by the name of Ralph McKenzie. But Christians are going to argue over this, and they're going to have different positions on it, okay? It could be that that's what Jesus was teaching. It could also be that it was considered a memorial, because when he's holding the elements there, they're obviously not his flesh. His flesh is holding the elements there, okay?
Right.
So this is something, as I say, Christians are going to argue over, and I think we can agree to disagree if we do disagree with transubstantiation, but we're not going to separate over that.
Right.
Okay? We're Christians, and it's not an essential of the faith. It's not like a salvific issue. So it's a little bit more complicated than we have time here in 2 minutes.
Right.
So I would just recommend that book.
Okay. Can I
All
shake
right.
your hand?
Yeah, sure, man. Thanks so much. Thanks for bringing it. All right, God bless you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hello, Frank.
Hey.
My name is Thomas. I'm here with my wife, Veronica. We came here from Czech Republic.
From where?
Czech Republic, Europe.
All the way to Oregon for this event?
Okay.
No.
To be honest,
Okay.
yeah, we are here to make our US trip, but like your presentation was on my bucket list for a long time, and I want to thank you for all your contribution, what you do, because when I became a Christian, 2011, like your answers and your presentations helped me a lot, you know, to understand and yeah, to make it clear for me. So yeah, it answers some questions. I still have questions, more and more, of course, you know. So
we all do.
Yeah,
Nobody has all the answers. Well, I had all the answers when I was 17. Okay, but I've learned since then. But anyway, go ahead. Yes, sir.
The more I learn, you know, the more questions come. So one of the questions is, like, how would you explain or justify or for someone who see a parallel between the stories, mostly from the Old Testament, where God commanded, for example, King David, to go and kill some tribe or people, including women and kids, with some events which we can see right now in the world when someone in the name of God go and kill and bomb people, including women and kids. And if someone see the parallel between this and this, and we know that it's wrong what people do, and then we see that God commanded them to do something what looks similar, what would you tell to this?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question, and it's kind of the Canaanite question. So let's take a look at the Canaanite question. You know, why did God command the killing of the Canaanites? Now, keep in mind that I'm going to give a very short answer here because there's a lot of nuance. There are books written on this. In fact, I was watching a podcast today from a guy who just wrote a book about this. But I'll give you a recommendation here. First of all, is it immoral for God to kill the Canaanites? First of all, if there is no God, killing anything isn't wrong because, as we mentioned before, if there is no standard of righteousness we're obligated to obey and we don't have any ultimate value, killing human beings is no different in the scheme of things than killing bugs because we're no more special than anybody else. So an atheist that brings this up, I'm going to ask, what's your moral standard by which you're claiming this is a problem? But it's a fair question for an atheist to ask, well, your God's a loving God? Why would he do this? Okay, fair question. All right. Next point. Is God arbitrary or does he give reasons for judging people in the Old Testament? Key word, judging. Does God just wake up one morning and say, Canaanites, I want them dead, like he's a mafia boss? No. These Canaanites have been sacrificing, among many other evil things they were doing, they were sacrificing their babies to Molech, that molten hot god idol where they'd heat up this metal idol, put their babies on it, and watch the babies basically get cooked before them. And even the Israelites were beginning to do this. And that's why Jeremiah, I believe in Jeremiah 7, basically says that you're going to be judged for this. Israel's going to be judged for this. And right after that, Nebuchadnezzar came in and wiped them out. So it's judgment. It's not just, hey, you know, I'm having a bad day. I want you guys dead. No, God waited 400 years before judging them. Also, and every college campus I go, atheists say, why doesn't God stop evil? Well, here's a situation where he does stop evil, but then they're complaining that he stopped it, right? I mean, you can't have it both ways. You want him to stop it or not? Well, you know, he's killing the kids. Well, first of all, Paul Copan in his book, Is God a Moral Monster, points this out. The passage in Deuteronomy 7 where God says, wipe everybody out, women, children, everybody. The next verse says, and then don't intermarry with them. What? If everybody's wiped out, how could you intermarry with them? In other words, and there's other argumentation behind this, is the way people talked in the ancient Near East was sort of ancient Near East trash talk. They would exaggerate, annihilate them, which just means defeat them. When he used those kind of words, according to Copan, he didn't mean it literally. He meant that you need to push them out of the land. You know, there was only 2 offensive battles in the land of Canaan when the Israelites came in. Jericho and Ai. Everything else was defensive. Okay? And Jericho and Ai were forts. They weren't there to kill civilians. They were there to take the fort. And if a battle was about to occur, most of the civilians would have ran anyway and gone elsewhere. But let's assume for the sake of argument it's not exaggerated, that God's literally told these folks to kill everybody and everything. Next point, is God committing murder by ending lives on earth? Can God murder someone? Is it murder for God? No, it's murder for us. It's not murder for God. God can kill any of us at any point for any reason. It's up to him. He's the creator of life, and he can resurrect life. We can't. We don't have that authority. God does have that authority. In fact, God has the right to usher people into the next life, whether they are 2 years old or 82 years old. People never die. They just change location, if indeed Christianity is true. Also, we need to recognize that the Old Testament theocracy was unique and temporary. It was not the ideal for all time, but the means to a promised new covenant. And Paul Copan goes into this in detail. This book, Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God, where he also points this out, by the way. God was concerned with sin, not ethnicity. In fact, as we read the Old Testament prophets, they, with God, are angered about Israel's disobedience, and they threaten divine judgment on Israel or Judah more often than they did on pagan nations. In fact, what did God do to the guys that worshiped the golden calf? According to Moses, kill them all, right? So it's not a genocide thing, it's a sinicide thing. And what you see today, and I'm shocked that this is happening here on American college campuses, but it is, and if you disagree with me, that's okay. This is going to be controversial, but you have the right to be wrong. There are people on college campuses that are actually supporting the new Nazi party. Has anyone in here read the Hamas Charter? Do you know what's in the Hamas Charter? Do you know? They stay in there, they say, land deals, waste of time. Their goal is to kill Jews. That's it. They want a one-state solution. All Jews dead. Don't take my word for it. Go read the thing. Now, this doesn't mean everything Israel does is right. Doesn't mean everything the U.S. does is right. I'm not a, my country right or wrong. No. If we do something wrong, we need to call it out. If they do something wrong, we need to call it out. But don't tell me an organization that has in their charter that their purpose is to murder Jews, that we ought to be protesting for that. Wake up. Know what you're doing before you go out there and do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you, Frank.
All right, thank you. And next time I'll tell you what I really think.
Dr. Turek, Thanks for coming.
Yes, sir. What's your name?
My name is Saxon.
Say again?
Saxon, like Anglo-Saxon.
I'm sorry, I don't have a monitor here, so say it again.
Saxon, S-A-X-O-N.
Oh, Saxon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's an Anglo-Saxon right here. Beautiful. Go ahead, sir.
It was my parents' name. Yeah, so thanks for coming. You're an apologist, and so...
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well said. So how do you respond to the atheist claim that a infinitely omnipotent and just God cannot exist in the context of evil and suffering? And then secondly...
What's that? I don't quite get that. What do you mean it can't exist in the context of evil and suffering? What do you mean?
Correct. That it's a mutually exclusive situation that an omnipotent, all-powerful God,
Yeah.
that who is also infinitely just, can exist in a situation where all evil and
Well, it depends on what you mean by that, because Jesus himself came into this world
evil and suffering
in his
exist.
human nature
Right.
and suffered for us. So according to Christian doctrine, and according, I think, to the evidence, he actually entered this world. And Jesus, of course, had two natures. He had a divine nature and a human nature. His divine nature is eternal. His human nature was added about 2,000 years ago to come into this universe as a perfect man and basically be a sacrifice, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. So he enters into his creation and suffers for us.
Right. I understand that because I'm a Christian and I believe that. But what I was really trying to ask is, when an atheist makes that assertion, how would you as an apologist respond? And then secondly...
Well, I would say that I think the premise is flawed, that God's human nature came into this world and did suffer. So why he says that that couldn't happen, I would say it's contrary to the fact. Now, Jesus had two natures, as I mentioned. Jesus' divine nature did not die on the cross, but the human nature did.
Okay.
All right. What's the second part?
And the second one is, how do you respond to the assertion against intelligent design of the anthropic principle, if you've heard of that? And then finally, what did you fly in the Navy? Thanks.
Okay, the anthropic principle, meaning that we just, the reason this universe is fine-tuned, or if I understand your question here, is that we wouldn't be here to observe the universe being fine-tuned unless it was. Is that what you're thinking? Sorry. Which is true,
Sorry,
but it doesn't explain anything.
The anthropic principle states that, of course, we find ourselves in a finely tuned universe.
Yeah.
If we didn't, we wouldn't be here if not. There's no other observation we can make.
Okay, first of all, that doesn't explain why the universe is fine-tuned. I'll give you an illustration. Let's suppose that we're playing poker, and I'm the dealer, and I deal myself a royal flush. You go, oh, lucky. But then I do it 5 more times in a row. Now, you're going, hey, man, you're cheating. And I go, oh, no, I'm not cheating. The only reason that you're upset is because we're in the universe where I get 5 royal flushes in a row by chance, and you wouldn't know that unless you existed. So what's more likely, that I'm cheating, or we just happen to be in the universe where I get 5 royal flushes in a row? What's more likely? It's more likely I'm cheating. I mean, you're not going to take that as an explanation. Well, if you weren't alive, you wouldn't be here to witness those 5 royal flushes in a row. You know, that's not a solution. That's not an explanation. Yes, sir. Go ahead. Yeah. At 8:30, right? All right. Well, we were told something else, but okay. Thanks.
I can't ask it.
If you enjoyed this live stream, please hit the subscribe button and be sure to check out these other helpful resources for more information on how to defend the truth of Christianity in this crazy upside-down world. Our website at crossexamined.org, the CrossExamined app for Apple and Android, the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast, all your favorite places on social media, onlinechristiancourses.com, and impactapologetics.com. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next live stream. God bless.